The origins of fascism are a really complicated topic. Lots of academics and activists debate it all the time. If you've been, reading the news, watching YouTubes, looking at TikToks, doing whatever in the last several years, you've probably come across a lot of people debating about what fascism is and what fascism isn't. Exactly how useful that debate is really depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to yell at somebody in the street at a protest, just call them a fascist, whatever. But if you're trying to figure out exactly who it is that you're fighting against and what they're probably going to try to do and what their motivations are, it is really helpful to know exactly what it is that you're dealing with. So, this video is part of a small series that I'm going to be doing talking about fascism and its origins, its historical through lines, where it came from, where it's going, who some of the leading political figures, political parties in fascism are. But this video is going to turn back the clock. We're going to be talking about the origins of fascism, both with Mussolini, the person who invented fascism, Adolf Hitler, the person who radicalized fascism and made it into the really terrifying example of, historical violence that we know it to be. But also, we're going to be talking about some of the people who came before them, people who are often called proto fascists. In this case, proto fascist just means people who came before fascists. Sometimes that means that they're kind of like fascists and maybe deserve to be called fascists, but technically aren't because they came before people like Mussolini. One example would be somebody like Napoleon III, who rose to prominence because of his relationship to his predecessor, his relative, Napoleon I, right? The Napoleon that you're probably thinking of, the guy, the little short guy, that guy. Napoleon III was the president of France. He won the presidency in 1848 and then declared himself the emperor of France in a self coup, like he staged a coup against himself, and was the second emperor of France from 1852 to 1870. He was the subject of one of Karl Marx's more excellent books, The 18th Brumaire of Napoleon. It's one of the best written works on the right wing ever. I highly recommend that you check it out. Napoleon III was a nationalist. He led a popular uprising against democracy. His movement had a sort of cult of personality around it, but he wasn't really like a revolutionary or a radical. In fact, to describe people like this, Karl Marx coined a term, a Bonapartist, and that's one of the terms that people use to describe things that are sort of like fascism, but which are not quite fascism. Another basically contemporary to that example would be the first Ku Klux Klan. The first KKK emerged in the United States, specifically in the US South, immediately following its loss during the American Civil War. In 1865, a group of people who had been involved with the Confederacy got together, formed sort of little militias and stuff in order to try to intimidate black people who had recently been enfranchised, to try to keep them from voting and try to keep them out of the political system in the United States. This expanded to the extent that it became a relatively roiling paramilitary sort of like small rebellion ongoing in the South, and broadly ended when the North abandoned the attempt to do serious reconstruction in the United States South. Now, these people were racists, they were certainly white supremacists, they were certainly male supremacists, but they didn't exactly have a political party, and they weren't really quite a mass organization. They weren't really recruiting out, out getting people in the street super duper openly, partly because of the way that the North was behaving at the time. Additionally, their motive wasn't the creation of a radical new world. They weren't revolutionaries, which fascists almost universally are. Instead, their political perspective can be described as revanchism. Revanchism means that you want to take back some territory that you think belongs to you. This is historically identified with a lot of European countries and nationalities before and after World War I, but it also really applies to the first KKK. They just wanted to turn back the clock to the antebellum South, whereas proper fascists want to build a radical new world, possibly in the name or the image of the past, but radically and transformatively altered. Now, the second Ku Klux Klan, which was founded in the 1910s, is also a good candidate for thinking about fascisms that come before fascism. The second Klan was founded not in the, heart of the post-bellum South, but instead by people who were not actually belligerents in the Civil War. They were too young to have experienced it, and it wasn't even mostly populated by people who were veterans. Instead, it was populated by people who were extreme right-wing radicals, people who were not only white supremacists, not only male supremacists, but were also opposed to Catholicism, opposed to Judaism, and even opposed to certain forms of like capitalist expression. They were America first in one of its first manifestations, right? They wanted to eliminate immigration. They wanted the United States to be an extremely Christian country. However, their political organization, it might be a good example of the first fascist political organization, but it wasn't necessarily an attempt to create like a partisan group that would contest elections or take over state power. Instead, they tried to present themselves as more of a like fraternal organization. Whether or not they would have been able to make it to achieve that kind of goal remains to be seen. If there is a fascism before fascism, it would be the second KKK. But beyond these groups, there are a bunch of other potential proto fascists, and there are just way too many to list here. Some examples are Charles Maurras, who was a French nationalist who would go on to lead and sort of inspire a bunch of Catholic nationalists not only in France, but also throughout the rest of the world. There's Gabriele D'Annunzio, who was an Italian nationalist who took and like seized and governed a city called Fiumi. It's now no longer called Fiumi; it's called Rijeka in the Croatia at this point. But at the time, it was disputed territory in Italy between Italy and what would eventually become Croatia, which was at the time going to be Yugoslavia, and it's sort of like tumultuous post World War I situation. D'Annunzio was one of the primary inspirations for Mussolini and thus predated Mussolini as a sort of fascist demagogue. There are also a bunch of other organizational precursors, like, for example, the German National People's Party, which was a German right-wing populist nationalist party that predated the Nazi Party. However, they, like most of these other proto-fascists, aren't exactly revolutionaries. They aren't trying to transform the world. Usually, they just want to turn back the clock. They just want to return to an imagined past. Whereas fascism, in contradistinction, is about trying to build a radical new world. That's their idea, right? They think that the world is sick and that they are the cure. And thus, we get the first fascist organization as such. The fascist organization founded by Benito Mussolini in 1919. I talked a little bit more about this in my previous video on Benito Mussolini's career. So Mussolini founds his first fascist paramilitary organization in 1919 and then transforms it into a political party in 1921, the Italian Fascist Party. Now, this is the first fascist party as such. It's the origin of the term as a right-wing political organizational name. Previously, fascism in Italy had just meant a sort of like populism, essentially. The idea was that people band together and become something stronger. That was what fascism meant, and that was why Mussolini sort of, used its cachet in order to develop his own political organization. In 1922, the Italian Fascist Party marched on Rome and staged essentially a coup that was participated in by the Italian government. They essentially acceded to the demands of the fascists to take on the government. Shortly after that, they passed what was called the Acerbo Law, so named after the legislator who proposed it. The Acerbo Law essentially guaranteed the Fascist Party a supermajority in the Italian parliament in perpetuity, granting them a one-party state essentially unassailable by any other political system. After this, the Italian Fascist Party was governing in Italy and probably would have continued to do so had World War II not intervened and deposed them from power. After this, the Italian Fascist Party became a series of different political parties that shifted and changed, going in and out of legality, ultimately evolving into the Brotherhood of Italy, the current ruling party of Italy. The German fascists had pretty similar origins to the Italian fascists. Largely, they were veterans of World War I who wanted to use their abilities in violence in order to take power. There were a lot of these organizations. There are like way too many to name. The one that happened to win out was originally called the German Workers' Party, so called by its abbreviation DAP. Adolf Hitler, as a young man, or as a, I guess, younger middle-aged man, joined this political party in 1919 and oversaw its transformation into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, aka the Nazi Party, by early 1920. They took on the example of the Italian fascists and staged a march on their political opponents. In this case, they engaged in what is called a putsch, which is a type of coup, a type of attempted coup, in which you use military prowess in order to take key strategic places in order to overwhelm your opponents. They did this by trying to take over the strategic city of Munich in southern Germany. This failed spectacularly. A bunch of Nazis died, lots of the rest of them were imprisoned, including Adolf Hitler. While in prison, he wrote his memoir, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, which became a bestseller in Germany and promoted his causes of anti Semitism, white supremacism, fascism, militarism, paramilitarism, anti leftism towards the forefront of German national culture and especially German political culture. This eventually resulted in the Nazis doing spectacularly much better in political elections in the late 1920s and early 1930s than they had before, ultimately granting them a position where the German president, a man named Hindenburg, felt that he was justified, or perhaps even obligated, to grant Hitler the chancellorship, essentially the prime minister position in Germany. Hitler then used his power as chancellor in order to crack down on all other dissenting groups, on all other political organizations, and to essentially transform the state into a German nationalist dictatorship run exclusively by the Nazi Party. In contradistinction to the Italians, most of the German political organizations that developed out of the Nazi Party remain very, very much on the sidelines of German political life. However, the current standard bearer of the extreme right wing in Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland Party, is now in German parliament and is doing relatively well in German elections. However, the German state has recently designated it as a far right organization, which is a very serious thing in German law because, they actually take this kind of stuff very seriously. The only other place in Europe and basically the world where outright fascists just like totally took power was in the country that is directly between Germany and Italy, or at least one of them, that is Austria. Austria is notable for, in the 1920s, being run by two contesting fascist political organizations. One of them was essentially just the Nazi Party, just an Austrian Nazi Party. Their platform was that they wanted Austria to be annexed by Germany. These people would eventually win, but originally they were being beaten in Austria by a group called the Fatherland Front, led by an Austro-fascist, that is, a fascist who wanted a sovereign, separate Austria, a guy named Engelbert Dollfuss. Dollfuss would eventually be assassinated by Nazis, and this resulted in an Austrian civil war, which his side eventually lost. Germany then eventually did annex Austria and bring it into its own political fold for the first time in, thousands and thousands of years. Throughout the rest of the 1930s, there were small fascist parties, paramilitary groups, little reading circles, basically everywhere in the world. This is the primary form in which people would encounter fascism. Not in terms of like big political parties and big mass movements that can actually contest state power, but mostly we're talking about rinky-dink small little groups that might have some influence on an extremely local level. They might try to commit some assassinations or kidnappings, or they put out some pamphlets or something like that, and eventually they get jailed and they have a martyr or something like that. Mostly that's what we're talking about. Some examples would be the German-American Bund in the United States, which was directly tied to the Nazi political movement in Germany. They're possibly most famous for staging a major political demonstration in Madison Square Garden in the United States. Another example would be the Falange in Spain. The Falange were one of the two main fascist organizations in Spain. The Falange were led by a man named Jose Antonio, who was the descendant of a previous and pretty recent Spanish dictator. The Falange were merged with a political organization, a different fascist organization called the JONS, the Juventud Ofensiva Nacional Sindicalista. And these two were eventually forced to merge with a non-fascist sort of traditionalist, that is monarchist. They wanted to bring the Spanish king back, political organization. They were forced to merge with this group by the Spanish dictator, Francisco Franco, who developed a political movement and a political system when he was the dictator of Spain that sort of used fascism as sort of like a front, like a way that you could get aesthetics that might be useful in order to get people on your side, but which didn't actually demand the extreme radical transformations that fascism asks of its people. This is primarily how fascism is encountered and how it mostly functions in political situations. Most of the time, the mainstream right, that is, the military, mainstream conservatives, possibly Christian conservatives, most of the time, fascism is a junior partner to these groups as they are trying to use their power in order to stop the left and the center from taking power. These mainstream right wing groups use fascists to do the dirty work. They use them to kill the left, they use them to stop democracy, and then they make them a sort of junior partner or appendix of their much more dominant political situation. That's what happened in Spain. A very similar thing happened in Romania, where their fascist political movement, which was pretty serious, the Iron Guard, was brought into the governing coalition of their country in 1940. But then, when they tried to take state power away from the more mainstream conservatives in 1941, they were ousted and removed from the governing coalition. The main takeaways here about the origins of fascism is that you can find it all over the place. It's not just in Germany, and it's not just in Italy, and it's not just in Europe. There are fascist organizations all over the world in the 1920s and the 1930s. Most of them stay pretty small. Most of them are reading circles, maybe like a radio show, maybe a publication house, maybe a small paramilitary organization. So that's the origins of fascism, a worldwide and very common political movement, political belief system that happened, because of various historical contingencies, to catch on in a couple European countries. Its victory there was not inevitable. It was the result of cooperation between fascists and conservatives. And most of the other times when this cooperation was tried, like for example in Romania, the conservatives actually win out. In almost every other situation, the fascists remain a relatively small and minor part of either a right-wing government, or they remain a small and minor rebellion against a liberal or centrist government.